Nobody in the control room dared breathe when the main engine began shuddering like a dying animal. The finest experts had already failed, warning screens blazed an angry red, and the entire town was only minutes from darkness and outright catastrophe. Then Mason Carter, a single father in a worn jacket, stepped through the door carrying a rusted toolbox. They laughed at him. But Grace, his 8-year-old daughter, knew her father was hearing something no one else in that room could detect, something buried deep in the iron and heat, a truth the machines themselves were straining to speak aloud. Stay until the end, because the secret inside that old wrench will bring every last one of them to their knees. The storm arrived without warning on the last Tuesday of October, the kind that bent oak trees sideways and turned the highway into a mirror of dark water. Morgan Energy Plant stood at the edge of town like a fortress of iron and humming wire, its smokestacks disappearing into low clouds that had pressed down since nightfall. Inside the main operations building, fluorescent lights buzzed steadily over a floor covered in cables and digital monitors, and for most of the previous decade, that building had been the heartbeat keeping Millhaven alive. Every hospital bed, every traffic light, every heated room in winter, all of it depended on what happened inside these walls. But on this particular night, the heartbeat was failing. The central engine, a 3-decade-old turbine system that had been retrofitted twice and nursed along with imported parts and engineering prayers, had begun a low grinding vibration just after 9 in the evening, and by 10:30, every alarm in the building was screaming. Elizabeth Morgan stood at the head of the control room with her arms crossed and her jaw set like stone. She was 41 years old, had inherited the plant from her father, and had spent the better part of 15 years keeping it functional through budget cuts, regulatory reviews, and 2 major labor disputes. She was not a woman who panicked, but as she watched the pressure gauges climb past their red thresholds and listened to the turbine room shake in a way that no software override could stabilize, something behind her eyes went very still. The damage was no longer theoretical. If the central engine failed completely, Millhaven's hospital would run on backup generators for perhaps 6 hours before its diesel supply gave out. 3 dialysis patients were scheduled for the overnight shift. The neonatal unit on the 4th floor had 4 premature infants on respiratory support. Elizabeth knew every number on those monitors, and every one of them was moving in the wrong direction. Jackson Reed had been pacing between workstations for the past 90 minutes, his team of 6 specialists typing commands into terminals that returned nothing but error codes. He was the kind of man who entered rooms already explaining himself, whose confidence had been acquired not from failure and recovery but from the careful management of situations in which failure was never allowed to be his fault. He wore a pressed white shirt even at this hour and carried a tablet under his arm like a badge of authority. He had been flown in by a consulting firm 3 months earlier, and in that time he had overhauled the plant's monitoring software, replaced several aging sensors, and installed a new diagnostic interface he had personally presented to the Morgan board as a significant operational improvement. What he had not done, it turned out, was fix anything. His newest software was now running a continuous diagnostic loop and producing the same result every 45 seconds. System anomaly detected. Recommended action unknown. He stared at the screen and said nothing useful. The gate intercom buzzed at 10:42. David Harris, who had worked security at Morgan Plant for 19 years, answered it. On the small screen he saw a figure in a rain-soaked canvas jacket standing beside a dented pickup truck, holding a metal crate with both hands. A girl stood beside him, no more than 8 or 9 years old, clutching the sleeve of the man's jacket with one fist and shielding her face from the rain with the other. David recognized the man immediately, not from any recent meeting but from the particular way he stood, straight-backed and patient in a downpour, the way a man stands when he has learned that the world will not make things easier simply because he waits for it. Mason Carter had come to deliver a machine part, a secondary coupling assembly he had machined and sold through a small parts supply contract that paid him less per unit than it should have. He had called ahead and was expecting to hand it off at the gate. But as he waited, he turned his head slightly toward the turbine building, and what crossed his face was not curiosity, it was recognition. David unlocked the gate and stepped outside. He asked Mason if everything was all right, and Mason answered quietly that the engine sounded wrong from the parking lot. Not electronically wrong, he said. Mechanically wrong, in the kind of way that computers were not designed to notice. David looked at him for a moment, then glanced back at the building where 30 people were fighting a machine they could not understand. He asked Mason to come inside. The control room fell briefly quiet when Mason walked in. He did not look like a man who belonged in the company of digital diagnostic platforms and engineering consultants with advanced degrees. His jacket was damp and dark at the shoulders. His toolbox was a battered metal case with a latching system held together by a replaced bolt, and his work boots were the kind that had seen years of shop floors and still showed it. Grace stood close beside him, her dark eyes moving carefully around the room, taking in the monitors and the wiring and the pale, stressed faces of the people who ran them. Mason set his crate down near the wall and turned his attention to the large viewing window that looked out onto the turbine floor below. Jackson Reed spotted him within seconds. He crossed the room with the measured stride of a man accustomed to removing obstacles and did not introduce himself. He asked who had let this person in and why he was still standing there. David explained that Mason was a machinist with 2 decades of industrial experience, that he had serviced turbine systems before, and that he had specifically noted an unusual mechanical pattern in the engine's vibration from outside the building. Jackson looked at the rusted toolbox, then looked at Mason, and said, with a particular kind of smile that required no kindness to produce, that this was a $100 million industrial turbine system and not a transmission job. One of the other specialists laughed. Another turned back to her monitor. Mason said nothing. Elizabeth stepped forward. She told Jackson to let the man speak, if for no other reason than the current approach was not working. Mason turned toward the window and looked at the turbine below for a long moment without speaking. Then he said that the primary vibration was not electrical interference and was not software-related. He said that what he was hearing suggested a mechanical imbalance along the central drive axis, specifically the kind caused by a secondary shaft running fractionally out of alignment in a way that would produce compound oscillation once the system hit certain load thresholds. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Jackson said, with the flat patience of a man explaining something to someone he had already decided was wrong, that the diagnostic system had already ruled out drive axis anomalies and that the problem was almost certainly sensor degradation feeding incorrect data into the load management protocol. Mason looked at him and said that was possible, and also that the sensor degradation might have been caused by the vibration rather than the other way around. Elizabeth asked Mason if he thought he could help. He said he did not know yet. He asked for permission to go down to the turbine floor and stand beside the engine for 5 minutes without anyone interrupting him. Jackson objected immediately and loudly. He said that Mason had no current engineering certification for this class of equipment, that allowing him on the floor would be a liability matter, and that the company could not be responsible for what happened to an unlicensed contractor in an active hazard zone. Grace, who had been standing quietly this whole time, tightened her grip on her father's sleeve but did not look away from the window. David Harris cleared his throat. He told Elizabeth that he had seen Mason Carter diagnose a production line failure at Hartwell Industrial 11 years ago, using nothing more than a flathead screwdriver and a strip of wire, in under 20 minutes, while 2 licensed engineers stood outside the building waiting for a permit. The failure, he said, had been 3 hours away from a total motor seizure that would have taken out a third of the factory floor. Mason had gone in without being asked and fixed it before anyone could stop him. Elizabeth looked at Mason for a moment. Then she looked at the pressure readings on the central monitor. A second relief valve had just triggered, and the backup dampeners were pulling more load than they had been designed to handle for sustained periods. She told Mason he had 15 minutes. Jackson Reed turned away from the group and said, to nobody in particular, that this was the worst decision anyone had made in this building tonight, which was saying something. Mason did not respond. He picked up his toolbox, rested his hand briefly on the top of Grace's head, and walked toward the turbine floor access door. Grace watched him go through the heavy glass, her expression composed in the careful way of a child who has learned to hold fear quietly, who has practiced being steady, because she understood that her father needed someone steady behind him when he stepped into places like this one. 22 years earlier, Mason Carter had been the kind of young mechanic that old-timers described as having it in his hands. He had grown up in Claremont, the son of a welder, and by the time he was 19 he could read a machine the way a physician read a patient, not just the readings and the numbers, but the underlying conversation the equipment was trying to have with anyone patient enough to listen. He had gone to technical college on a partial scholarship and graduated second in his class, then spent 4 years at a regional manufacturing company working his way from floor assembly to precision systems maintenance. He was methodical without being slow, careful without being timid, and the senior engineers who trained him agreed that what separated Mason from his peers was not brilliance in the conventional sense but a quality harder to teach. He trusted what he heard. Hannah Briggs came into his life during his 3rd year at the company. She worked in quality control, and she had the same rare habit of listening that Mason did, though she applied it to people rather than machinery. They married when Mason was 26, and for 3 years they built something quiet and solid together, a small house on Ardmore Street, a savings account they were using to fund a repair shop of their own, and a plan they had sketched out on notebook paper and taped to the kitchen wall. Hannah was the one who kept the notebook. She wrote down every piece of equipment they wanted to start with, every license they needed to obtain, every month's financial projection. The notebook had a small wrench sketched on the cover. Mason had drawn it for her on the evening she first proposed the idea, and she had laughed and told him it was the best logo for a business she had ever seen. Their daughter Grace was born in the spring of the year the plan was supposed to begin. She arrived 4 weeks early and spent her first 11 days in the neonatal unit of Claremont General, and Mason and Hannah took turns sleeping in the chair beside her incubator, and the savings account was not touched because they decided it no longer mattered. When Grace finally came home, she was smaller than they had expected but considerably louder, and the apartment on Ardmore Street became something neither of them had planned for, and both of them were unprepared to love as completely as they did. The accident at Forsyth Industrial happened on a Thursday morning in November, when Grace was not yet 2 years old. Mason had raised concerns about a pressure fitting on one of the main assembly line compressors 3 weeks before the incident. His written report had been received by the shift supervisor, acknowledged in a meeting, and then quietly filed away. The replacement component that was eventually installed was not the one Mason had specified. It was cheaper, sourced from a supplier the facility manager had a financial arrangement with, and it was rated for a pressure threshold 40% lower than the system required. When it failed, the resulting pressure release caught Hannah at close range. She survived the initial impact but not the internal injuries. Mason held her hand in the hospital for 16 hours. She never regained consciousness. The investigation that followed spent considerable energy examining Mason's maintenance records and very little examining the procurement decisions that had led to the faulty component. His report was cited as incomplete. The conclusion was inconclusive. Mason left the industry. He sold the house on Ardmore Street and moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the other side of Millhaven, where rent was lower and the neighbors did not know his name, and he found work fixing cars and trucks and the occasional piece of farm equipment for anyone who needed it. He machined parts by hand and delivered them in the back of his truck and came home in the evenings to help Grace with her homework and cook whatever was in the refrigerator. Grace grew up hearing the sounds her father worked by, the steady ringing of metal on metal, the sustained note of a lathe, the soft clicking of calibration tools being returned to their case. She learned early that the toolbox he kept in the corner of the garage was not ordinary. He cleaned it once a month, the way some fathers polished shoes or changed oil according to a schedule. She knew what each tool was for and had asked him once, at around age 6, why he never threw away the oldest ones. He had thought about it for a moment and said that old tools were the ones you could trust because they had already proven themselves. She had accepted this without question and gone back to her drawing. Back in the present, Mason set his toolbox on the graded floor outside the turbine access panel and unlatched the lid. The inside was lined with felt that had worn smooth over years of use. In the upper tray, among the calibrated wrenches and offset pliers and a small micrometer, there was a single open-end wrench that was different from the others. It was older, its finish worn to a dull silver in the places where a hand had gripped it most, and along its shank, in lettering stamped with a jeweler's punch, was the name Hannah. Grace had seen him take it out many times. She watched now through the thick glass of the viewing window and did not look away. The turbine hall was a different world from the control room above it. The heat hit Mason at the door, a dry, radiating press of warm air that carried the smell of stressed metal and machine oil and something faintly chemical that he identified as overheated insulation on the secondary wiring harness along the east wall. The engine itself was enormous, a horizontal turbine assembly running nearly 18 feet in length, flanked by a network of pipes and pressure manifolds and instrumentation clusters that had been added and modified over 3 decades until the original machine had disappeared almost entirely beneath its own upgrades. What had not been upgraded was the core mechanical assembly at the center, and it was this that Mason moved toward, walking slowly, trailing his fingertips along the outer casing to feel the vibration pattern as he went. He crouched beside the central bearing housing and stayed there for almost 2 minutes. Not touching anything, just listening. The vibration had a compound quality, a primary cycle overlaid by a secondary tremor running at a different frequency, like a drumbeat with an echo coming from slightly the wrong direction. He had heard something similar once before, at a manufacturing plant in his early career, where a secondary shaft had been installed a fraction of a millimeter off-center during a routine overhaul. The misalignment was too small to catch with standard instruments during static testing. It only became apparent under load, and by then the compound resonance it produced had a way of convincing every sensor in the vicinity that the problem was somewhere else entirely. He was fairly certain he was listening to the same mistake now. He stood and went back to his toolbox for a locking clamp and a 40mm wrench. He keyed his radio and told the control room that he needed them to partially shut down the portside cooling circuit for 40 seconds, just long enough for him to isolate the vibration source without the cooling interference masking the reading. Elizabeth relayed the request. Jackson's voice came immediately over the speaker, tight and controlled, informing everyone who was listening that reducing coolant flow during a high-load event was exactly the kind of decision that could trigger a thermal runaway and that he would not be held responsible for what happened next. Elizabeth told him she understood his objection and that she was authorizing the action. The coolant circuit went quiet. Mason moved quickly, fitting the locking clamp against a secondary damping ring he had identified as the likely amplification point, tightening it by hand and then by wrench until the ring was firmly constrained. The vibration in the casing changed almost immediately, a drop in the secondary tremor, a smoothing in the compound oscillation. Through the radio he heard someone in the control room say it quietly, it was working. He finished tightening and stepped back, and the engine ran steadily for 8 seconds. 10. 12. The pressure readings on the remote display he could see from the floor began to migrate back toward their normal range. Then the sound changed. It changed the way a river changes when a dam upstream gives way, not gradually but in one decisive moment, the tone dropping and accelerating simultaneously, and before Mason had fully registered what was happening, the number 3 relief valve blew with a concussion that he felt in his chest rather than heard. The pressure spike was not large enough to cause structural damage, but it was enough to send a visible shockwave through the array of pipes above his head, enough to trip 2 secondary breakers, and enough to immediately and comprehensively undo everything the locking clamp had just accomplished. In the control room, Jackson was speaking before the vibration even settled. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He said that the readings were now worse than they had been before Mason touched anything, that the secondary valve event had been entirely predictable given what Mason had done to the coolant circuit, and that whatever brief stabilization they had observed was exactly what happened when you applied mechanical interference to a vibration problem without understanding the underlying system load. He said this clearly and completely, in the way of someone who had prepared the statement in advance. Elizabeth stared at the monitor. The numbers were confirming what Jackson was saying. The engine was louder now, angrier, the compound oscillation more pronounced. Grace heard it through the viewing glass. She was old enough to understand what the faces in the room were saying even when no one was speaking, and she understood that the faces were saying her father had just made things worse. Her chin came up. She did not cry immediately. She held it for a moment, the way her father had taught her by example rather than instruction, the way a person holds something heavy and tries to decide whether they can carry it. Then it became too heavy, and her eyes went bright, and a single quiet sound escaped her before she pressed her lips together and looked back through the glass at her father, who was standing in the turbine hall below, not panicking, not looking at the failed damper with despair, but staring at it with an expression Grace knew from her earliest memory, the careful, still focus of a man who has just learned something important from something that went wrong. Mason keyed the radio. He said, quietly and with precision, that the failure of the locking clamp had not made the problem worse. It had made the problem visible. Something else was wrong with this engine, and it had been wrong for some time, and what had just happened had not introduced that wrongness, it had forced it into the open where someone could finally see it. He found it 12 inches to the left of where he had been working, tucked behind the primary governor assembly in the kind of location that maintenance teams checked at scheduled intervals rather than by instinct. The governor itself was a rotational speed controller, one of the original components designed to regulate the engine's output under varying load conditions, and in a machine this age and this size it was one of the most critical single parts in the system. It was also, Mason now saw with increasing certainty, not the original part. The mounting bolt that secured the governor housing had been replaced with a fastener that was the correct diameter but the wrong alloy, a lesser-grade steel that would not carry the same thermal expansion tolerances as the component it replaced, and under the specific combination of heat and load the plant had been running all evening, it had expanded just enough to introduce a microscopic play in the governor shaft that was producing every anomaly the diagnostic system had been unable to source. He looked at the bolt for a long time without touching it. Then he radioed the control room and described what he was looking at. He gave the technical specifications from memory, the correct part number, the alloy rating, the torque specification, and the approximate degree of dimensional drift that would result from a thermal mismatch under current operating conditions. There was a pause. Then Elizabeth asked him to confirm what he was saying. He confirmed it. He said the bolt was not a match for the governor's specification, that this was not a normal wear failure, and that someone had put it there intentionally or through a catastrophic negligence that amounted to the same thing. David Harris was already pulling the maintenance log at the security station. The plant kept paper backup copies of all service records, a requirement from the original plant construction that Elizabeth's father had refused to drop despite repeated recommendations to go fully digital. David ran his finger down the most recent governor service entry, dated 11 weeks prior. The technician name on the record was a third-party contractor, but the oversight signature, the stamp required for any governor-adjacent maintenance to be considered closed, was Jackson Reed's. Jackson had been standing near the control room door with his tablet when David spoke the date out loud. The color that left his face did not return. He said, immediately and with the polished reflex of a man who had rehearsed this in some part of his mind he had not admitted to himself, that the records could be misread, that his signature represented procedural authorization rather than technical approval, and that it was Mason who had just destabilized the engine with an unauthorized modification. Nobody in the room looked at him when he said it. Elizabeth remembered something. 3 months earlier, when Jackson had first arrived, she had asked him to review the plant's parts procurement process. He had recommended consolidating their supplier network for efficiency and had provided a list of approved vendors that she had forwarded to the parts manager without scrutinizing closely. One of those vendors had been listed with a note that said preferred pricing arrangement in place. She had interpreted this as a cost savings. She understood now what it actually meant. The cheaper parts had come from somewhere that made money on the margin between what they charged and what a correct part cost, and someone had been collecting the difference. Mason was still on the turbine floor, and he had not heard any of this. What he had heard was something else, the specific sound of the governor shaft wobbling in its housing, a sound that the ear could not quite catch consciously but that the hands could feel as a very faint irregularity in the casing temperature, a thermal ripple running along the surface of the metal at roughly the frequency of the shaft's rotation. He put his palm flat against the housing and counted the pulses. He knew what had to be done. The governor bolt had to be replaced while the engine was still running, because shutting it down under these conditions would risk a pressure lock in the secondary manifold that could damage the turbine blades and require a full rebuild. The window for a controlled replacement was narrow and would require working inside the active governor compartment with the shaft in motion. This was not something that was commonly done. There were reasons it was not commonly done. He stood and radioed. He said he needed 5 things: a 12mm chromoly bolt from his toolbox second tray, a torque wrench set to 38 foot-pounds, a pair of insulated heavy gloves from the wall cabinet near the access door, confirmation that the secondary coolant circuit would be held at reduced flow on his request, and for Grace to come to the radio. The room absorbed the last request in silence for a moment. Elizabeth looked at Grace, who was already moving toward the communication console. Grace picked up the handset and said that she was there. Mason's voice came through, steady and unhurried, and he told her that he was going to fix the engine. and that he needed her to read him the pressure numbers from the turbine load gauge every 30 seconds starting now, and to keep her voice even because he needed to concentrate. Grace looked at the gauge. She read the number. Her voice did not waver. He tied the safety line at his waist himself, looping it through a rated anchor point on the floor, grating and checking the clip with 2 fingers before letting it go. The heat inside the governor access area was substantially higher than the surrounding floor, a localized pocket of radiant warmth coming off the housing that pressed against his face and hands the moment he leaned in. He had done this kind of work before, in circumstances that were not exactly the same but close enough that his hands remembered the muscle memory even if his mind was still making calculations. He fit the insulated gloves, tested his grip on the chromoly bolt in his right hand, and set the torque wrench across his knee where he could reach it in one motion. Grace's voice came through the radio in clear intervals. 41.5, 41 and 7. The numbers were steady and she was reading them the way he had asked, flat, factual, with no editorial commentary about what they meant or whether they were moving in the right or wrong direction. He taught her this without realizing he was teaching her, simply by modeling it every time she helped him in the shop, every time she handed him a tool and he narrated what he was doing and why, and she had filed it all away with the same precision she brought to her schoolwork and the small notebooks she kept in the drawer beside her bed. David brought her a stool so she could reach the console comfortably. Jackson said something under his breath near the door, something that carried the rhythm of objection without committing to any specific word that could be quoted later. Elizabeth looked at him once. It was a look without anger, which made it considerably more frightening than anger would have been, and he stopped talking. Mason reached the governor mounting point and assessed the bolt. It had not sheared, which was the fortunate outcome. A sheared fastener in this location would have required extraction tools and additional time he did not have. It was, as he had suspected, simply underspecified for the task, and it had walked fractionally out of its seat under thermal expansion. He fitted the extractor, applied reverse torque in 3 careful increments, and felt the bolt release on the third. He withdrew it and held it between 2 fingers for a moment before setting it on the grating beside him. It was lighter than it should have been. The material was visibly softer at the shank. Whoever had selected this part had either not understood what they were doing or had not cared, and Mason found himself unable to determine which possibility was worse. He had the chromoly replacement seated against the governor housing and was threading it by hand when the wrench slipped. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second's interruption in grip as the insulated glove's outer layer caught on a raised edge of the housing, but the wrench dropped from his hand and fell cleanly through the narrow gap in the floor grating below, producing a hollow metallic sound as it hit the subfloor 12 inches beneath. He went still. He assessed the situation without announcing it on the radio, which was the habit of a man who knew that speaking panic aloud accomplished nothing except spreading it. He looked at the governor bolt, now hand-tight but requiring another 22 foot-pounds of torque to reach specification. He looked at the gap in the grating. He looked at the toolbox 3 feet behind him. He thought about the upper tray. He keyed the radio. He told Grace that there was a screwdriver in the upper tray of the toolbox, the one with the red electrical tape on the handle, the one that had been in the box longer than she had been alive. He asked her to tell him what was written on the handle below the tape. There was a brief pause. Then her voice came through, and she said there was a name. He asked her what name. She said Hannah. He told her to remember that name and to hold the line. He reached back without looking. The toolbox was exactly where he had set it, and his hands found the upper tray by position, and his fingers closed around the handle of the screwdriver. It was Hannah's tool, the one she had bought at a hardware swap meet the year they met, the one she had used in the shop on weekends, the one that had been in the box since before Grace was born and had never been discarded because Mason had never been able to think of a reason to. He turned the shaft of the screwdriver against the chromoly bolt, fitting it into a machined groove in the bolt head that was not designed for a screwdriver, but that accepted the shaft with sufficient friction for what he needed. He applied measured torque in a slow, sustained motion, 1 degree at a time, counting the increments by the resistance in his fingers. The governor shaft stopped wobbling. He held the torque for 5 seconds to confirm. Then he withdrew the screwdriver and held it against his chest for a moment with both hands before returning it to the upper tray. He keyed the radio one more time and told the control room that he was closing the governor housing and they should watch the vibration readings on the primary display. He refastened the housing cover by hand. He did not rush. He reset the locking clamp he had placed earlier, this time correctly, adjusted for the absence of the vibration that had been distorting the load readings, and secured it to specification. He stepped back from the assembly and stood still for a moment. Listening, the secondary tremor was gone. The compound oscillation that had been layering itself over the primary engine note since before he arrived had resolved, the way a dissonant chord resolves when the correct note is finally found. The engine was running. Not just running cleanly, at its proper frequency, the deep even hum of a machine that has been returned to itself. He put his hand against the casing one more time, feeling the smooth vibration of a drive assembly in alignment, and he exhaled slowly. Grace's voice came through the radio. She said 40 and 9, 40 and 6, 40 and 3. And then, after a pause, in a voice that was trying very hard not to be anything other than the steady voice he had asked her to keep, "Papa, the numbers are going down." The monitors in the control room confirmed what Grace had read aloud. The load gauge was descending. The secondary pressure indicators were stabilizing. The vibration sensors, which had been returning incoherent cascading anomalies for the better part of 2 hours, were settling into the kind of linear baseline that operations engineers dreamed about during crisis events. Elizabeth stood in front of the main display and watched the numbers move and said nothing for a long time. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when they have been very loud for a long time and the loudness is suddenly absent, a silence that carries weight and the particular awareness of people realizing they are not sure what comes next. 1 second passed. 2. 3. The engine did not spike. The relief valves did not trigger. The compound oscillation that had been shaking the building's concrete floor since before 9 o'clock was simply gone, resolved into the steady working note of a machine that had found its correct operating frequency and was holding it without effort. Elizabeth let out a breath so carefully that it was almost inaudible. Someone behind her, one of the younger engineers on Jackson's team, said something very quietly that might have been "That's it," in the tone of a person who has not fully decided whether to believe what they are seeing. Then the lights in the main grid panel ran green from left to right like a wave, and a second later the town grid indicator board illuminated across all 7 distribution zones, and the real-time demand monitor showed normal residential and commercial draw resuming throughout Millhaven. In the hospital 3 miles away, the backup generator coordinator who had been standing beside the generator room door for the past 40 minutes heard the main feed restore and made 2 calls, one to the charge nurse on the 4th floor and one to the dialysis unit, and both calls said the same thing: they were back on primary. Mason walked out of the turbine hall into the short corridor that connected it to the operations floor. He was moving slowly, not from injury but from the particular tiredness that comes after high-concentration physical work, the kind that settles into the hands and shoulders and the space between the eyes. His jacket was dark with heat and his left forearm showed a burn mark about 2 inches long where the housing edge had contacted his skin during the governor work. He was looking at this when the door at the end of the corridor opened, and Grace came through it at a pace that her father would later describe as 100% of her available velocity. She hit him somewhere around the midsection and held on. He put one hand on the back of her head and the other on her shoulder and stood there in the corridor while she caught her breath. Neither of them said anything immediately. Outside, through the building's walls, he could hear the storm still going, still loud, and beneath it, from the turbine hall behind him, the steady voice of the engine running true. After a moment, Grace pulled back enough to look at him. She asked him if he was all right. He said he was. She looked at the burn on his forearm and then looked at his face and then looked at the burn again. He told her it was nothing and that she had done very well on the radio, that she had kept her voice exactly the way he needed it, and that it had helped him more than she knew. She nodded with the composed expression of someone storing this information for later consideration. Then she asked if it was fixed. He said he thought so. She said, with the straightforward confidence of an 8-year-old who has decided the case is closed, that she knew it was. In the control room, Jackson Reed stood near the north wall saying nothing, his tablet held against his chest in a way that had stopped resembling authority. His team worked with focused attention and made no eye contact with him. David Harris stood near the corridor door, not blocking any exit this time. Jackson's departure was inevitable and arranged rather than something that needed preventing. 2 members of the plant's safety board had been called and were on their way in. The maintenance log, with Jackson's signature on the governor's service record, had been photographed and copied and sent to Elizabeth's personal archive before anyone in the room had said a word about what should happen next. Elizabeth initiated a formal review of Mason's case 3 days after the engine event. She did this not because she was required to, but because something David had said during the long aftermath of that night had stayed with her. He had mentioned, only in passing, that Mason had once filed a report about a defective pressure component at another plant and that the report had gone nowhere. She had not thought much of it in the moment, but in the days that followed, as her team dismantled Jackson Reed's procurement arrangement and traced the falsified parts documentation back through 7 months of service records, she found herself returning to that sentence. It had the tone of something that happens twice. She requested the archived incident records from Forsyth Industrial, which had closed 11 years ago, but whose safety documentation had been transferred to a state archive as a condition of the closure settlement. The report arrived digitally after 4 business days, 400 pages of investigation materials, testimony transcripts, and equipment service logs. She read the section on the failed pressure fitting first, then the section on the replacement component that had been installed against specification. Then she found the maintenance record that predated the accident by 22 days, the one that showed a technician's notation of potential fitting mismatch, and above that notation, in the approved by field, a name that was not Mason Carter. Mason had filed his concern. It had been recorded, routed to a supervisor, and sat in a pending review queue for 19 days before the fitting failed. The investigation had not followed this documentation trail because it had been partially mislabeled in the archive under a secondary equipment reference number rather than the primary fitting identifier, and the investigators had not caught it. The conclusion attributing operational fault to the maintenance team, of which Mason was a member, had been reached without the investigators having seen his initial report at all. Elizabeth called Mason on a Wednesday afternoon. He was in his garage when the phone rang, working on a late-model truck with a timing issue. Grace was at school. He listened to what Elizabeth told him without interrupting. When she finished, he thanked her and said he needed a few minutes and that he would call her back. He set the phone down on his workbench and stood next to the truck and looked at the wall where the toolbox sat, the toolbox that was closed, and the wrench with Hannah's name was inside it. And he stood there for what he later said was 3 or 4 minutes, though he was not certain. The truth did not undo what had been lost. It did not restore 12 years, or return the years that Grace had spent without a mother, or reclaim the workshop that had never been opened. Mason understood this clearly, and he did not expect otherwise. What the truth did was simpler and more permanent. It restored the shape of what had actually happened, which had been distorted for so long that Mason had half accepted the distortion as fact, the way the eye adjusts to darkness until it forgets what full light looks like. Several people came to see him in the weeks after the story moved through Millhaven. Some had worked with him at Forsyth. Some had lived in town long enough to have formed opinions they had never reconsidered. They came to his garage or called or said things to him at the hardware store, and what they said in most cases was some version of "I'm sorry." Mason accepted these without drama. He did not carry grievances and he did not perform forgiveness. He said thank you and moved on. Elizabeth offered him the position of Mechanical Safety Director at Morgan Plant, a title she had created specifically for this situation and intending specifically for him. He asked for a week to think about it. He spent that week driving Grace to school in the mornings and working in the evenings and thinking about the Forsyth report and about the 17 workers on that production line who had not known that the fitting above their heads was wrong, and about the fact that knowing things and saying them and being heard were not the same thing, and that the gap between them was where most of the damage in any industrial disaster actually lived. At the end of the week, Grace told him what she thought. She said that her mother had spent her whole working life making things safer and that it would be a shame if the work stopped here. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Then he called Elizabeth. He took the position with 2 conditions. The first was that Morgan Plant establish a formal worker notification protocol requiring any safety concern raised by a line-level employee to be reviewed by an independent panel within 72 hours, with full documentation, and with the raising employee protected from retaliation by a written policy that Elizabeth countersigned personally. The second was that the plant fund a technical training program for young workers entering the trades, offered free of charge, combining hands-on mechanical instruction with documentation practices and teaching participants not only how machines work but how to speak clearly and persistently about what they observed. Elizabeth agreed to both conditions before Mason finished stating the second one. He began teaching the following January, in a room off the main operations corridor that the plant had cleared and outfitted with 3 workbench stations, an engine section display, and a whiteboard. The students were between 17 and 24 years old, most of them from Millhaven and the surrounding towns, most of them planning careers in manufacturing or utilities or infrastructure maintenance. Mason taught them the way his father had taught him, and the way experience had refined everything after that, by demonstration, by repetition, by making them close their eyes and describe what a machine sounded like before and after an adjustment, until they could hear the difference themselves. Grace came with him on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the evenings he held class. She did her homework at the small desk in the corner of the room, listening to her father's voice explain pressure dynamics and load tolerances and the proper way to document a service anomaly in terms someone who was not present could reconstruct. Sometimes she looked up and watched the students taking notes, and sometimes she asked her father a question during a break that was sharper and more precisely aimed than anything the older students had thought to ask, and Mason answered it with the same attention he gave to every question she had ever brought him. The wrench with Hannah's name on it was placed in a small display case mounted to the wall of the training room, between the first set of instructional diagrams and the window that looked out toward the plant floor. It was not labeled. Mason had not put a card beside it explaining who Hannah was or what the wrench meant or why it was there. He had simply put it on the wall the way a person places something they want to be present in a room, not for explanation but for company. The students rarely asked about it, but occasionally one would stand in front of the case for a moment before class, looking at the worn handle and the stamped letters, and Mason would notice and say nothing, because the looking was enough. On a Thursday evening in late March, after the other students had left and the workbenches were cleared, Grace looked up from her homework and asked her father whether she would ever be able to repair an engine the way he did. He was wiping down one of the bench surfaces. He stopped and looked at her, and then he crossed the room and opened his toolbox and took out the screwdriver with the red tape on the handle and set it on the desk in front of her. He said that she had already started a long time ago. She picked up the screwdriver and turned it in her hands the way he turned tools, carefully, as though learning the weight of it, and outside, through the building's walls, the engine in the turbine hall ran on, steady and even, like a kept promise, like a name spoken quietly in a room where someone was finally listening.